Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is Professor Cole Matheson here with a mini lecture on relative clauses. Relative clauses are quite complex and they infer an understanding of independent clauses. So first we should think of what an independent clause is. Independent clauses follow the basic syntax or the basic word order of subject, verb, and predication. Your predication can be an object, it can be an adverb. Sometimes there are even adjectives at the end of sentences. Relative clauses demonstrate the same internal order of words or the same internal syntax as independent clauses. We can get a little bit more complex than that when our relative pronoun is an object, but we'll get to that in just a moment. First, we should think about the semantics of relative clauses. Why do they exist? Well, of course, relative clauses exist to give us extra information about nouns. That's why we have them. Just like adjectives give us extra information about nouns. So we can think about relative clauses as adjective clauses. And indeed, many textbooks will refer to relative clauses as adjective clauses, and that's to simplify the terminology. During the lecture, I will say relative clause, simply because this is what I'm most used to, and this is what I have the most experience with. It just kind of comes second nature, but you can use adjective clause synonymously. It means the same thing. Okay, so our focus for today, of course, will be relative clauses modifying direct objects. But that's not to say that relative clauses can't modify other nouns in other positions. Indeed, relative clauses can modify nouns in nearly every position. Most commonly, we will hear relative clauses in spoken English. That doesn't mean that they can't be in the subject position. They are commonly in the subject position, but usually we see those in writing and less in speaking. Relative clauses can modify indirect objects, but this is a rare case. Only certain nouns in the indirect object position accept relative clauses. But indeed, relative clauses are very important to demonstrating fluency of English grammar. They demonstrate a level of proficiency. So if you are able to demonstrate relative clauses, you are able to demonstrate a superior level of writing. Okay, this is one mark of proficiency in writing is the correct use of relative clauses. So that's what we're going to talk about first here. Of course, your basic independent clause, and by independent clause I mean complete sentence, your basic independent clause syntax, your independent clause word order will be subject, verb, and along with the verb comes the predication. For our purposes here, we'll stick with simplicity, subject, verb, object. Okay. So we want to think about subjects, verbs, and objects first. Okay, so we can think of a couple different examples here of sentences which demonstrate the syntax of an independent clause. Something like the boy German. English is a Germanic language. We will say German, one of our roots here. Same essential pattern here, with our subject being the boy, the verb being speaks, and the direct object being German here. This is more of a classic kind of direct object because the boy and German are not the same referent. This is not a subject complement in any case, but essentially here what we want to do is be more concise than this, especially if your subjects are duplicated. So when you're writing, you shouldn't think too much about relative clauses in your drafting phase. When you should think of them is in your revision stage. After having composed a paragraph or an essay, look at your sentences. Are you repeating the same subject over and over again? Well, if that's the case, you have a perfect opportunity to demonstrate a relative clause. Okay. So we're thinking here about the boy as being common to both subjects in both sentences. Okay. So we think here the boy who speaks German is my friend. What is the independent clause of this statement? Well, of course here, the boy is my friend. It's the same as was above here. But what did we do? We inserted the second sentence as a relative clause. We have cut down on the word count. We have made the statement more concise. Okay, but how did we do this? That's the question. Well, of course here, our relative clause is who speaks German. The same syntax is demonstrated here in terms of subject, verb, and direct object. Who is the subject of the relative clause? This is very important to understand. Who is the subject of the relative clause? It is replacing boy. So what is this word here, who? How is it working? Well, we call it the relative pronoun. Okay, we call it the relative pronoun. What do pronouns do? They replace nouns. So he could replace the boy just as easily as who replaces the boy. The difference is that who is the relative pronoun. He is not a relative pronoun. Okay, so we're looking here. We have the same internal syntax as the main clause. Subject, verb, direct object here. Okay, so this is what we consider as a modification of the subject of the sentence. But as we said at the beginning of the lecture, modification of subjects is a little less common in terms of relative clause usage. It still exists, but it's a little less common. So what would be a more common construction? Well, that is our focus for the video lecture here today. Modification of direct objects. Okay, so let's do a little erasing here and a little analysis of how we might create a sentence which is a bit more common to spoken English. Well, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video lecture here, my top sentence is it contains what's called a subject complement. Okay, it contains a subject complement. Essentially what this means is that the subject and the subject complement can be interchanged. Alright, so this is what I want to do now to illustrate a more common form. From the boy and my friend, we can exchange these two perfectly simply by exchanging their positions. So my friend is the boy. Okay. Because it's in the subject complement position here, because the subject and technically the object for our discussion here are the same referent, we can change these two. We can't change these two because this is a more classic direct object here as opposed to the subject complement which we find here. Okay, so our previous sentence modified the subject. Now, how might we modify a direct object? Okay, more commonly here, we would begin, my friend, which of course is in our subject position, just as it is up here. Okay, we want to come with the full statement though, all right, because we're modifying the direct object. We're not modifying the subject this time. Okay, so we'll have the full statement. My friend is the boy. Okay, so we have our be verb here, and we have our direct object, or, of course, for consistency, our subject complement. And then we would have our relative clause, quite common in spoken English here. The boy who speaks German. Okay, so just as your relative clause was modifying a noun before, the relative clause is still modifying a noun. All relative clauses modify nouns. The main difference here is that our relative clause, put in brackets here, is now referring back to a direct object. Okay. Same internal syntax of the relative clause. We have the subject of the relative clause, which is also the relative pronoun, the who. We have the verb, speaks, and here we have our direct object. Okay, so here we see a clear pattern here. Subject, verb, object. Subject, verb, object. You must have a subject and a verb minimally in every relative clause. You are not writing a grammatical relative clause if you do not have a subject or a verb. Okay, in this case, you actually need the direct object as well. Okay, so in this case, it's modifying the direct object. Okay, so far we've only talked about relative pronouns in subject position, but this isn't the only kind of relative clause. It's not the only kind of syntax in a relative clause. Sometimes your relative pronoun is not the subject of the sentence. It is not the subject of the relative clause. Sometimes your relative pronoun is the direct object of the sentence. And this is where most people run into trouble. I usually do not find individuals having trouble with the relative pronoun in the subject position. It usually gets a little bit tricky when we're looking at a relative pronoun that's actually a direct object. Alright, so this is what I want to talk about next. When might we use the relative pronoun as an object? Okay, so make a little room here. We still can use our basic sentences to illustrate the other kind of relative clause. Okay. So relative clauses as demonstrating relative pronouns, which are objects, not subjects. This is where we want to turn next. Okay. So our sentence might be, my friend is the boy, or girl for that matter. We need to take a second sentence here though. Okay, so because our same referents are in the subject position, we need a new second type of sentence here to be more accurate and to create a second kind of context here. Okay, so we might say, I introduced you to the boy during grammar class. Well, we have to analyze how this sentence is different. Okay. Our relative pronoun is still going to refer to the boy, all right? But now we have a new subject of our relative clause. And of course, that subject will be I. Naturally, I is the subject of the second clause. Introduced is going to be your verb phrase, and you, the direct object. Then to the boy is a prepositional phrase, might be called also an adverbial. An adverbial or prepositional phrase. And then during grammar class is an ing participle clause. It is actually going to function as an adverb as well. All of these adverbs, or both of these adverbs rather, are giving you extra information about, this would be an adverb, not adjective. Adverb, and this is, of course, an ing participle. Okay. So you notice it was nice and easy earlier when the subject of both regular statements was the same. It was my friend or it was the boy. There was no variation there. Okay. But now there is variation in the sentence's subjects, isn't there? We have my friend as one subject of a sentence, and we have I as the subject of the second sentence. Okay. So now back down to our main sentence here. My friend is the boy, keeping with our same sentence here, but the question is, how do we create the relative clause? Well, just as earlier, when the relative pronoun is in the subject position, even when the relative pronoun is in the object position, it still comes first. All relative clauses begin with a relative pronoun, unless, of course, they're being deleted, but that's a lesson for another day. Okay, so we're thinking here, my friend is the boy. Relative pronouns must introduce relative clauses. So here, it will be whom. Okay, and this is because the relative pronoun is in the direct object position. Remember, we're also modifying the direct object of the main sentence. So make sure you keep distinguished in your mind modifying a direct object versus a relative pronoun as a direct object. They're two different concepts here. Here, of course, we're modifying the direct object with our relative clause. Here is a relative pronoun that is a direct object. And of course, as we analyzed up here, our prepositional phrase is our noun. So the question is, how do we translate the boy into a relative pronoun? Well, the boy is an object of this prepositional phrase. Okay? Because it's an object, it's whom. Okay? If the relative pronoun is functioning as an object in the relative clause, it's always whom. And that's how you tell the difference between who versus whom. Is the relative pronoun a subject? Who. Is the relative pronoun an object? Whom, with an M at the end. Okay, so we want to finish out the rest of this sentence here. And of course, we're not going to repeat this section because it's being included here. The boy is the whom. All right, so we would delete that part of the sentence here. Okay, so when we have the boy whom I introduced you to, my friend is the boy whom I introduced you to during grammar class. Okay. You notice in the statement here, we do not have the direct object being copied and pasted essentially, right? It's missing. The boy is missing from this statement, you see? I introduced you to whom? Well, of course, whom is the boy, right? But remember, relative pronouns always introduce relative clauses, regardless of whether it's a subject or regardless of whether it's an object. Relative pronouns introduce relative clauses. Here we see that the object of the preposition has disappeared. Or has it? It actually has not. Instead, it's been picked up and dropped right here. Okay, so that's how we know it's an object, because it's all the way over here and it has disappeared from this position. And it has been included under the position of whom. So the question is now, okay, how do you tell the difference between who versus whom? Well, yes, I mentioned in class in our lecture here that relative pronouns as subjects are who, and relative pronouns as objects are whom. Well, if you're having trouble understanding the difference between the two, always look for what is the word immediately following the relative pronoun. What grammatical category is the word immediately following the relative pronoun? Well, if it's a noun, it's whom, every time. And this is only for distinguishing who versus whom. For dealing with which or whose, some of the other relative pronouns, this doesn't work. But if you're confused, is it who or is it whom? Look, if it is a noun, it's always whom. Because this is the subject of the relative clause, right? This is the verb, right? We have our adverb missing the object of the preposition, which has been included here. And we have our ing participle clause also functioning as an adverb. Everything is there in one way or another. The only difference is that the object of the preposition has been included as a relative pronoun here. In the other cases, the boy who is my friend, right? A verb immediately follows the relative pronoun. Not a noun, a verb. That means the relative pronoun is the subject. Every single time, if you have a verb after your relative pronoun, it will be who. So then the question is, well, of course, this is an object, relative pronoun here. Okay, so just to recap, we want to be thinking about relative clauses modifying objects. And you see here in the main sentence, we have our subject, we have our verb, and we have our direct object, or for cases of consistency, our subject complement. All of this relative clause, from beginning to end, is modifying the direct object of the sentence. Okay? So here we have a relative clause with a relative pronoun as a direct object, modifying the direct object of the main clause. Okay, and earlier I showed you the relative clause with the relative pronoun in the subject position, modifying a direct object. Okay, so make sure to write down any questions that you may have, post them to the comment page here, or you can email me as well. Everyone have a wonderful day, and I will see you very soon.